The gun was already leveled at Ezekiel Abbott's chest when Birdie Barrett kicked open the door to his office. She had not planned to draw the weapon. She had told herself the whole 11 days of hard riding from Abilene to the town of Redrock, Texas, that she would be civil, that she would be measured, that she would walk through that door like a woman of business and not like the widow of a man who had died because someone in this very building had stolen every cent he had ever earned. She had told herself she would speak calmly, she would present the papers, she would collect what was owed. But then she had seen the safe behind his desk, and the way he had risen from his chair too fast, and the way his hand had moved toward the drawer, and something ancient and cornered had risen in her chest, and the Colt Navy revolver her late husband had pressed into her hands on the night he lay dying was suddenly pointing straight at the broadest, most infuriating chest she had ever seen on a man. "Do not touch that drawer," she said. The man behind the desk did not touch the drawer. He did not speak either. He simply stood there with his hands raised to shoulder height, his dark eyes moving over her face with an expression that was not quite fear, was not quite anger, was something far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of those things. He was younger than she had expected. She had built a monster in her mind over 11 days of riding, and the monster had been old and fat and easily broken. This man was none of those things. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more, and he had the kind of stillness about him that men earned through difficult living rather than through comfort. His jaw was dark with several days of unshaved growth. There was a long scar running from his left ear toward the edge of his chin, old and silver-white, and his dark shirt was rolled to the elbows in the late afternoon heat, revealing forearms that spoke of real work, not the soft-palmed idleness of the men who had ruined her husband from a comfortable distance. "You are Ezekiel Abbott," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "My name is Birdie Barrett. My husband was Thomas Barrett." And before you say one word that is not the direct answer to a direct question, I want you to understand that I have ridden 11 days to reach this town. I have not slept more than 4 hours on any one of those 11 nights. I have lost my husband, my home, and my livelihood, and I have nothing left to lose, which means this pistol is the most honest thing in this room, and I am not the least bit afraid to use it. Something shifted in his face then. Something opened and then closed again, quick as a shutter. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, very quietly, "there are some things you have been told about me that are not true." She had known he would say something like that. She had prepared for something like that. She had told herself every single night of that long ride that a man like Ezekiel Abbott would be smooth and practiced in lies the way a river stone is smooth, worn down by constant use. What she had not prepared for was the way he said it. Not slick, not rehearsed, raw in the way that truth sounds when it has been waiting too long to be spoken. She kept the gun up. "Then you had better start proving it," she said. "Because I came here to collect what is owed, and I am not leaving until I do." He looked at the gun. He looked at her. And then slowly, carefully, he reached not toward the drawer she had warned him about but toward the shelf above the safe, and he pulled down a leather-bound ledger and set it on the desk between them, and he said, "Then sit down, Mrs. Barrett, because what I am about to show you is going to change what you think you know about your husband's death, and you are going to need to be sitting when it does." She wanted to refuse. Every bone in her body wanted to refuse. She sat down. That was the beginning of everything. Birdie Barrett had arrived in Redrock, Texas, on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1873, which meant that the cattle drives from the summer had long since concluded, and the town had settled into the particular, restless quiet of a frontier settlement between seasons. The year 1873 was not a kind year anywhere in the American West. The financial panic that had gripped the East in September had sent shockwaves all the way to the cattle ranges and the homesteads, and men who had borrowed against their land to expand found themselves called to account for debts they had no means to pay. Banks were failing. Mortgages were being foreclosed. And somewhere in the machinery of all that ruin, Thomas Barrett had gotten caught. Birdie had been 26 years old when she married Thomas. She was 28 when he died. They had built something together on a small parcel of land outside Abilene, Kansas, nothing grand, a modest cattle operation that Thomas had worked from first light to last dark for 3 years. He had borrowed $500 from a lender in Redrock to expand the herd in the spring of 1872, when beef prices were high, and the future seemed to stretch out bright and clear as a summer sky. The lender's name on the document had been one Clarence Doyle. But Clarence Doyle, Birdie had since discovered, was not a real person. He was a name, a shell, a fiction invented by someone else to conduct business that could not bear to carry a real man's signature. The trail of that fiction had led her here, to this office, to a building with the name Abbott Land and Cattle Co. painted on the glass of its front window. She had made a mistake. She could see that now, sitting across the desk from Ezekiel Abbott, watching him open the ledger with the particular care of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. The mistake had not been in coming here. The mistake had been in assuming she already knew the story. "Your husband borrowed money," Ezekiel said, spreading the ledger open between them. "I know that because I have been trying to untangle who from for the better part of 8 months. Clarence Doyle is not a name I invented, Mrs. Barrett. It is a name I have been hunting. Because Clarence Doyle, or whoever is operating under that name, has also borrowed against my company's assets, forged my signature on 4 separate land transactions, and is currently holding liens on 3 properties in this county that should, by right and by law, belong to me." Birdie stared at him. She had not lowered the gun yet. It rested on the desk now, her hand still on the grip, but the angle had shifted. She was no longer pointing it at him. She was simply keeping it close. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that we have both been robbed by the same man." "I am telling you that we have both been robbed by the same man," he confirmed. "And I am telling you that the name Clarence Doyle is the only thing I can prove at this moment, but I have a strong, evidence-supported suspicion about who is underneath that name, and it is someone you may have already met." She thought about the men she had spoken to in the weeks after Thomas's death. The sheriff in Abilene, who had been sympathetic but helpless. The lawyer who had reviewed the loan documents and told her, with the practiced regret of a man who makes a living from other people's disasters, that the debt was valid and the foreclosure was lawful. The bank manager who had pointed her toward Redrock as the source of the original lending arrangement. And then there had been the man who had come to the house 3 days after the funeral, well-dressed, soft-spoken. A man named Marcus Hale, who had introduced himself as a business associate of the lender, and had offered, with deep apparent sympathy, to buy what remained of the Barrett property at a price she had recognized even in her grief as an insult. She had told Marcus Hale to get off her land. "Marcus Hale," she said. Ezekiel Abbott went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. "He came to my home after my husband died. He wanted to buy the property." The stillness in Ezekiel's face cracked open, and for just a moment she saw something burning underneath it, something that looked a great deal like the particular rage of a man who has been circling a truth for months and has just watched someone else walk straight to the center of it. "Marcus Hale," he said, and his voice was careful and controlled in the way that very quiet rivers are sometimes the deepest ones, "was my business partner until 14 months ago. He left this company with access to several accounts and several stamps and several signed blank documents that I, in a moment of catastrophic trust, had left in a shared filing cabinet. And when I discovered what he had done with those documents, he had already disappeared into the kind of distance that makes a man very hard to find." Birdie set the gun down on the desk. She did not holster it. She simply set it down. Her hands were steady. She had inherited steadiness from her mother, a woman who had crossed 3 states in a covered wagon and had never once, as far as Birdie knew, allowed herself the luxury of trembling. "My husband died of a fever," she said, "in February." While the bank was calling in the debt, and while the cattle were dying in a cold snap, and while the stress of all of it was sitting on his chest like a stone. The fever took him in a week, but the fever was not what killed him. What killed him was the debt, and what killed him was the fraud. "I know," Ezekiel said, and then after a pause that carried enormous weight, "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Barrett, genuinely." She studied him for a long moment. The afternoon light through the window was the color of old brass, catching the dust in the air and the silver of his scar and the dark of his eyes, and Birdie Barrett, who had not allowed herself to feel anything except focused, righteous purpose for 11 consecutive days, felt the first small crack appear in the wall she had built around herself. She sealed it over immediately. "I did not come here for sympathy," she said. "I came here for $500, which is the principal of the loan my husband took out. I came here for the return of the lien on my property, which is currently preventing me from selling or mortgaging the land. And I came here for the name of the man responsible, which you have now given me." "I cannot give you the $500 today," Ezekiel said. "Not because I do not intend to, but because the accounts that Hale drained are still tied up in a legal proceeding that my lawyer has been managing since the spring. But I can give you something else today. I can give you documentation that proves the original loan document was fraudulent, that the signature on the lending agreement is a forgery, that Clarence Doyle never existed, which means the lien on your property is void." Birdie's breath left her body slowly, quietly, like a door closing rather than slamming. "You have that documentation," she said. "I have been building that documentation for 8 months, he said, "because I suspected there were other people in exactly your position, and because I intended, when the time came, to make it right. I just did not expect the person I needed to make it right for to walk through my door pointing a pistol at me." And then, to her enormous surprise and his own apparent astonishment, they both said nothing for a moment, and the silence between them was the first honest silence she had experienced in a very long time. She stayed. She had planned to collect the documents and ride out that same evening. That had been the plan. Get in, get what was owed, get out. She had a room booked at a boarding house at the edge of town, had paid for one night in advance with the last few coins she was willing to spend on anything that was not food for her horse. But Ezekiel Abbott needed 2 days to get the full set of documentation together. His lawyer, a methodical, slow-speaking man named Archibald Prout, who had an office on the town's main street, had the relevant papers locked in his filing cabinet and would not be back from a circuit ride until Saturday morning. It was Thursday evening. 2 days. She told herself she would stay in the boarding house and keep to herself. She would eat the meals that came with the room price. She would read the book she had packed, a battered copy of Ivanhoe that Thomas had owned and that she had carried without quite knowing why. She would not think about the man with the dark eyes and the silver scar. She thought about him almost immediately, not in the way she would later think about him, not yet, but in the way that a person who has been operating entirely alone for months suddenly becomes acutely aware, in the presence of another person, of what it feels like to be understood. He had not challenged her grief. He had not minimized her loss. He had not treated her as a hysterical woman who had made a mistake or a fool who had been taken advantage of through her own naivety. He had spoken to her the way one person speaks to another when both of them are standing in the wreckage of the same disaster, surveying the damage together. She was not used to that. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle man. But he had also been a man of his time, which meant that he had carried things alone and allowed her to carry things alone, and they had both been so determined to be strong for each other that sometimes she had felt the loneliness of being in a marriage while still being fundamentally on her own. This was not a thought she liked having. It felt like a betrayal of a man who could no longer defend himself, and she tucked it away in the same interior cabinet where she kept all the thoughts that were true but not useful. On Friday morning she went back to Ezekiel Abbott's office. She told herself she went back to check on the progress of the documentation. He was already there when she arrived, despite the fact that it was barely past sunrise and the town outside was only beginning to stir. He had coffee on the small wood stove in the corner of the office, and he poured her a cup without asking, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and they talked. They talked for 3 hours. She had not talked like that, she realized, since before Thomas died. Not about real things. Not about the kind of things that reveal the actual shape of a person. He told her that he had come to Texas 6 years ago from Virginia, which explained the softness at the edges of certain words. He had come west because the war, which had ended 8 years prior, had left Virginia looking like a place where the future had already been decided, and decided badly, and he had wanted to make something in a place where the future was still a question. She told him that she had come to Kansas from Ohio with her parents when she was 14, which was the year her father had decided that Ohio was too settled and too certain, and that a man of vision needed to be somewhere the land was still speaking rather than already spoken for. "Your father sounds like he was a difficult person to live with," Ezekiel said. "He was the most infuriating man I have ever loved," she said, and then she laughed, which surprised her because she had not laughed since February. He smiled. It was not a smile that took over his whole face. It was a careful smile, a smile that had clearly not been used frequently enough to have worn itself a permanent groove, and it moved something in her chest that she was not ready to acknowledge. She acknowledged it anyway, privately. She was honest with herself. It was one of the qualities her mother had insisted on as non-negotiable. She was attracted to this man. She was a 28-year-old widow who had been riding alone through dangerous country for 11 days on a mission of righteous fury, and she was sitting in the early morning light in his office drinking his coffee and finding him interesting and quietly, alarmingly attractive. These were facts. She arranged them in her mind the way she arranged inconvenient weather, noting their existence without letting them alter her course. He had dark eyes that she kept noticing. He listened the way very few people listen, with his whole body at attention, as if what she was saying was genuinely the most important thing in the room. And he spoke about the land and the sky and the cattle business with the particular love of a person who chose their life rather than inherited it. By midday, she had been in his company for most of the morning and had not once thought about the gun she had pointed at him the previous afternoon. He asked if she had eaten. She admitted she had not. He had a standing arrangement with a woman named Consuelo Reyes, who ran a small eating house 2 buildings down, and he brought back 2 plates of rice and beans and roasted chicken, and they ate at his desk, and he told her about the fraud case in more detail. Marcus Hale had been, by Ezekiel's account, a charming man, a convincing man, the kind of man who makes you feel in his presence that you are exactly the type of person he has been looking for. He had approached Ezekiel 4 years ago with an investment proposal that had seemed sound and had been, in the early months, genuinely productive. The trouble had begun in small ways that were easy to rationalize. An account balance that was slightly lower than expected, a document that appeared to have been signed at the wrong time, a business trip to San Antonio that lasted longer than stated and generated no receipts. Ezekiel had confronted him about the discrepancies in September of 1872. Hale had been smooth and explanatory and convincing, and Ezekiel, to his own subsequent disgust, had believed him. A month later, Hale was gone. The blank documents were gone. $300 from the operating account was gone, and the slow, expanding horror of what had been done in his name had begun to reveal itself. "I trusted him," Ezekiel said, and there was something in his voice that was neither self-pity nor performance, just the flat, clean accounting of a man cataloging his own errors. "That was my failure. I could see the warning signs and I chose to believe in the explanation rather than the evidence." "People do that," Birdie said. "When we care about someone or when we need a situation to be what we need it to be, we choose the explanation that lets us keep going." He looked at her. "Is that what you did with Thomas?" It was a direct question, Not unkind, not probing, just direct. It startled her with its honesty. "Thomas was a good man," she said carefully. "He was not a dishonest man. But he borrowed that money without telling me until after it was done. He said he had not wanted to worry me, which meant he had not wanted me to disagree with him, which is a different thing, and I knew that, and I chose to believe the version that was easier to live with." Ezekiel nodded. Not a nod of agreement, not a nod of judgment, a nod of recognition. "Two people in a room both carrying hidden things," he said. "That seems to be the human condition," she replied. He looked at her for another moment, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was not a word and was not a touch, but was something more significant than either of those things. A moment of being genuinely seen by someone who had not previously known you existed. It was alarming and clarifying, and she was not sure she was prepared for it. She went back to the boarding house that afternoon. She sat on the narrow bed and held Ivanhoe in her hands without opening it and thought very seriously about what she was doing. She was not doing anything, she told herself. She was waiting for documents. She was being practical and organized in a practical, organized situation. The fact that she found Ezekiel Abbott interesting and good-looking and unexpectedly easy to be honest with was a coincidence of proximity, nothing more. She would have the documents on Saturday. She would ride back to Kansas. She would use the documentation to clear the lien on the property. She would sell the property and use the money to start something new, somewhere new, possibly in a place where the winter was less brutal and the memories were less thick on every surface. She would not think about dark eyes and careful smiles and the way he had said, "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Barrett," as if he actually meant it. She thought about all of those things for the rest of the afternoon. On Friday evening, the situation became significantly more complicated. She had gone out to check on her horse at the stable at the edge of town, a gray mare named Constance that she had owned since before her marriage, and loved with an uncomplicated fierceness that she sometimes envied herself for. She was in the stable giving Constance an apple from her pocket when she heard two men talking in low voices in the alley behind the building. She would not have paid them any attention except that one of them said a name, Marcus Hale. She stood very still in the stall beside Constance. The voices were not clear exactly. The stable wall between them muffled the consonants, but she caught pieces, enough pieces. "Hale says the widow came looking for Abbott. Not supposed to happen yet, the papers are not. Told you we should have moved faster before. Abbott gets that lawyer involved with the fraud case, the whole thing comes apart." Then footsteps. Then silence. Birdie stood in the dim stable with her hand on Constance's neck and her heart beating in a way that was not fear, exactly, but that recognized the proximity of danger the way a horse does, in the instinctive animal part of the body that is older and more honest than thought. Marcus Hale was not just gone. Marcus Hale was still operating, and he knew she was here. She went back to Ezekiel's office at a run. He was still there, working at his desk by lamplight, and when she burst through the door he came to his feet fast and looked at her face and said nothing, just waited, because he had already understood from her expression that something had happened. She told him what she had heard. She told him precisely, word for word, because she had a good memory and had always understood that precision was the difference between being believed and being dismissed. He did not dismiss her. "Sit down," he said, and his voice had changed. The careful, measured quality was still there, but underneath it now there was something focused and hard, the voice of a man shifting from civilian into something older. She told him she preferred to stand. "Then stand," he said, and began moving around the office with the efficiency of a man who has had to relocate quickly before. He went to the safe first, and opened it, and took out a stack of documents and put them in a leather satchel. He went to the desk drawer, the one she had warned him not to touch on her first afternoon here, and she saw now that it contained not a weapon but another set of documents, and those went into the satchel too. "Where are you taking those?" she asked. "We," he said, correcting her, "are taking these to Archibald Pruitt's house, not his office, his house, tonight." Because if Hale has men in this town who know you are here and know about the fraud case, then his office is the first place they will look and his files are the first thing they will take. Birdie thought about this. If Hale is still running the fraud operation and your documentation threatens to expose it, then the threat is not just to the documents, Ezekiel said. He looked at her steadily. You understand that? I understood that before I rode into this town alone, she said. I simply did not know that the danger was specific rather than general. Something moved across his face that she did not quite have a name for yet. You came here alone, he said. I told you that. Knowing there might be danger. Yes. Why alone? She looked at him for a moment. Because there was no one else. The words landed in the room with a weight she had not intended. They were true and they were simple, and they were the loneliest thing she had said aloud since Thomas had died. And saying them to Ezekiel Abbott in the lamplight of his office with his satchel of documents in his hand felt, for one terrifying moment, like setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. She picked it back up. She straightened her spine. Shall we go see this lawyer then? She said. They went out the back of the building because the front door faced the main street, and the main street was visible from anywhere. Ezekiel led her through a series of alleys and back passages, with the familiarity of a man who knows his town in the dark as well as in the light, and she followed him with her hand near the gun at her hip and her eyes moving to every shadow. Archibald Prout lived in a small, tidy house at the north edge of Redrock, with a vegetable garden in the front yard that was doing bravely despite the season. He came to the door in his nightshirt and spectacles with a lamp in his hand, squinting at them with the resigned expression of a man who has long since accepted that his profession brings people to his door at inconvenient hours. He let them in. He listened. He was, Birdie discovered, a considerably more useful person outside his professional office hours than he appeared to be inside them, because stripped of his official manner, he was direct and quick, and took the situation seriously without theatrics. If Hale has people in town, Prout said, then we need to move the case. I have been in correspondence with a federal circuit judge in San Antonio who has expressed interest in the fraud evidence. If I can get a letter to him by tomorrow's post and get these documents to him by the following week, we can have a federal warrant in Hale's name within a month. Can you get the documentation for Mrs. Barrett's property settled before then? Ezekiel asked. Prout looked at Birdie. The fraudulent lien. Yes. I can draft the affidavit tonight. You sign it, Mr. Abbott, and I sign it as a notarized witness, and Mrs. Barrett has a legal instrument that voids the lien on her property. The original loan agreement is unenforceable under fraud. Tonight, Birdie said. Tonight, Prout confirmed. Sit down, Mrs. Barrett. This will take approximately an hour. She sat down. Ezekiel sat beside her. Prout disappeared to his study and the sound of pen on paper began, steady and purposeful. In the quiet of Prout's small, book-crowded sitting room, with the lamp burning low and the night pressing against the windows, Birdie sat next to Ezekiel Abbott and felt, for the first time in 11 days, that the ground beneath her feet was something more solid than memory and determination. She was acutely aware of him beside her, of the warmth of him in the cool October night, of the way his hands rested on his knees, still and certain. You did not have to come tonight, she said quietly. Yes, I did, he said. Why? He turned his head and looked at her. In the lamplight his eyes were very dark and very direct, and there was nothing hidden in them, no performance, no angle, just the clean, uncomplicated honesty of a person who has decided to stop pretending. Because this should not have happened to you, he said. And because the man who made it happen operated under my name, using my trust, and that makes me a part of the story whether I intended to be or not. And because, he paused. The pause was brief but complete. Because you rode 11 days alone into an uncertain situation for a principal, and that deserves to be honored. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a generous way to describe pointing a gun at you, she said. You had every reason to point a gun at me, he said. I am glad you pointed it at my chest and not my head. She laughed again. The second time she had laughed since February. Prout came back with the affidavit an hour later as promised. Ezekiel signed it. Prout notarized it. Birdie held the document in her hands and read every word of it twice, slowly. And when she was satisfied it said what it needed to say, she folded it with great care and placed it inside the inner pocket of her coat, against her ribs, where it would be warm and protected. They walked back through the dark town in a different route than they had come, and the night was cold and clear in the way that Texas October nights are when the season has fully turned, and the stars above them were vast and uninterested in the small, urgent dramas of human beings, and Birdie was aware of every step that closed the distance back to the boarding house, aware of it in the way you are aware of a song ending. They stopped at the corner nearest her lodging. There was a lamp burning in the window of the boarding house. The street was quiet. "You should bolt the door tonight," Ezekiel said. "I intended to," she said. "I will be at my office early. Come when you are ready," she nodded. She should have said good night and gone in. She stood for another moment instead. "Mr. Abbott," she said. "Ezekiel," he said. "Given that you have pointed a gun at me and I have taken you through alleys in the dark, I think we can manage first names." She studied him. "Ezekiel," she said, and the name sat easily in her mouth, which surprised her. "Thank you." He looked at her. "Birdie," he said, just her name, just that, and it was the first time anyone had said her name in quite that way in a very long time, with that particular quality of attention, and she felt it go all the way down to her sternum. She went inside. She bolted the door. She sat on the bed for a long time before she slept. Saturday morning came in bright and cold, and Birdie was at Ezekiel's office before 8 o'clock. She told herself it was because she wanted to make an early start, get the final papers, and begin the long ride back to Kansas before the day was too advanced. She told herself this several times while braiding her hair in the small cracked mirror above the washing stand in her room. She told herself this while riding Constance down the main street and tying her to the post outside his office. She walked inside and he was already there, and he had coffee, and she sat down and the morning came in through the window, and she thought about nothing in particular except how easy it was to be in this room. There was a moment, somewhere in that second morning, when the conversation had paused and they were both just present and quiet, and she had looked at his hands, those working hands with the calluses of real labor, resting on the edge of the desk, and she had thought with a clarity that startled her, "I want to touch those hands." She had never been an impulsive person. She had been raised by practical people in a practical part of a practical country, and she had always understood that feeling something and acting on it were two entirely different conversations. But she also understood, because her mother had been very clear about this, that the heart is a more honest organ than the head, and that dismissing it entirely is a form of cowardice. She did not touch his hands, but she allowed herself to notice the wanting, which was a different kind of honesty. Archibald Prout arrived at 9:15 with the full packet of fraud documentation. He laid it out on Ezekiel's desk with the satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something of genuine use, and they spent 2 hours going through it piece by piece, making sure that everything was accounted for, every forged signature, every false transaction, every borrowed identity that could be traced back to Marcus Hale. In the stack of evidence, there was a list of names. People who had borrowed money from Clarence Doyle. People whose properties were encumbered by fraudulent liens. There were 7 names on the list. Thomas Barrett was one of them. Birdie looked at the list for a long time. "There are other families," she said. "Yes," Ezekiel said. "What happens to them?" Ezekiel looked at Prout. Prout looked at the list. "Once we have a federal warrant," Prout said, "and once the fraud is legally established, each of these liens can be contested and voided, but it requires each family to have documentation of their specific case." "How many of them know?" Birdie asked. "How many of them know the loan was fraudulent, that they don't actually owe the money?" "I would estimate," Prout said carefully, "that none of them know." Birdie set the list down. She looked at Ezekiel. "Someone should tell them." "Yes," he said. "I could find them," she said. I know what it is to be on the other end of this, to think you owe a debt that is tearing your life apart. If I went to each of these families and told them what I know, showed them the evidence, that is a long ride, Ezekiel said. 7 families in different places. I have already ridden 11 days, she said. I know how to ride. He was quiet for a moment. Prout looked between them with the expression of a man who has enough experience of human nature to know that the conversation had acquired a dimension that had nothing to do with him. I have thought about making that same ride, Ezekiel said. I have been thinking about it for months, but I cannot leave the legal proceedings here unattended, and I cannot leave the office unattended with Hale's people potentially active in the area. He paused, but I could send copies of the relevant documentation with someone I trusted. Are you asking me to be your agent? Birdie said. I am asking if you would consider it, he said. You would need to return to Kansas in any case. 2 of the families on that list are in Kansas. The others are in different parts of Texas. Birdie considered this with the full weight of attention she gave to decisions that mattered. She thought about riding back to the empty house in Abilene. She thought about sitting in that silence with the memories and the cleared lien and nothing else. She thought about the fact that she had been planning to sell the property, and that there was, therefore, nothing pulling her back except habit and grief was something she could carry anywhere. She also thought about the 7 names on that list, and about the fact that somewhere in Kansas or Texas there was a family sitting on a debt they did not know was a fraud, and perhaps the husband of that family was already sick, already crumbling, already being ground down by the weight of a lie someone else had told. I will do it, she said. Ezekiel looked at her for a long, complicated moment. You do not have to. I know that, she said. That is why I am saying I will. He nodded. Then he said, I would feel considerably better if you were not doing it entirely alone. Birdie raised her eyebrows. I have been alone since February and have managed adequately. I did not say you were incapable, he said. I said I would feel considerably better. There was a silence in which Prout apparently found something extremely fascinating about the corner of the ceiling. What are you suggesting? Birdie asked. I am suggesting, Ezekiel said carefully, that I hire an additional man to manage the office for 6 weeks and that I accompany you on the ride to these families. I have a personal obligation here. My name was used to hurt these people. It should be my face that appears in their doorways and explains what happened. Birdie studied him. She was looking for the hidden motive. She had become very good at looking for hidden motives in the way that people who have been betrayed become good at looking for the architecture of betrayal in everything. She did not find one. She found instead a man who was looking at her with an expression of careful, transparent hope. 6 weeks, she said. Possibly 7, he said. On horseback. Mostly, he said. There is a stretch of Texas that would be faster by train. She looked at the list again. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. We leave Monday, she said. They left on Monday. The first 2 days were purely practical, covering ground, adjusting to the rhythm of traveling together. Birdie was an efficient rider who did not complain and did not require constant entertainment, which she gathered from the slightly surprised quality of his appreciation was not entirely expected. She had packed light and well. She kept her own counsel. She was not a woman who filled silence with noise. He matched her in this. They rode for hours, sometimes with nothing between them but the sound of hooves on the October road and the wind in the dry grass. And it was, Birdie found, one of the most companionable kinds of silence she had ever experienced. They talked when there was something to say. They talked in the evenings when they made camp, small fires in the cold Texas dark, coffee from the pot she had packed, food from the provisions they had bought in Redrock. He cooked surprisingly well for a man who had lived alone for several years. She told him that. Survival is a powerful teacher, he said. What did you do before Texas? She asked. Before Virginia, even. Where are you from originally? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, gathering. I was born in Virginia, he said, but I grew up mostly moving. My father was a Methodist circuit preacher. We lived everywhere and nowhere for most of my childhood. I learned to read from a Bible and to cook from whatever was available and to sleep anywhere that was flat. He paused. And I learned that nowhere becomes home until you decide it is. Is that what you did with Texas? I decided, he said simply. 6 years ago, I said this is the place and this is the work and this is mine. And it was for a while until Hale. He looked into the fire. He took the work and the money and the good reputation, but he did not take the decision. The decision is still mine. Birdie thought about her own decision. About Ohio and Kansas and the choice her father had made and the choice she and Thomas had made and the fact that she was now, at 28, in the position of making a decision about the next part of her life with no roadmap and no guarantees. I do not know where my place is, she said. I thought it was the land in Kansas, but the land was Thomas's dream more than mine. I cared about it because I cared about him. Without him, I am not sure it is mine. What would be yours? He asked. She considered this seriously. It was the kind of question she had been avoiding for 8 months because the answer was too uncertain to be comfortable. Something I built, she said. Something that was mine from the beginning, not inherited and not adopted. I was good at the business side of the cattle operation. Better than Thomas, if I am honest, which I am trying to be. The numbers and the markets and the negotiations. I was good at those things. You should be doing those things, he said. It was not a compliment exactly, more of a matter-of-fact observation, the way someone says the sky is blue. But it hit her differently than a compliment would have. It hit her like being believed. They reached the first family on the list on Wednesday afternoon, 4 days out from Redrock. A homestead south of a small town called Weatherby, a couple named the Garcias, Miguel and Esperanza, who had borrowed $120 against their land to sink a new well. They had 2 young children who watched from the doorway while their parents stood on the porch and listened to Ezekiel explain, with great care and genuine regret, what had been done to them. Esperanza Garcia cried. Not theatrically, not dramatically, just quietly, with the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a fear for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. Her husband held the documentation in his hands and read it 3 times and asked 2 precise, intelligent questions that Birdie answered. And then he shook Ezekiel's hand and then, surprising everyone including himself, he shook Birdie's hand as well. Riding away from the Garcia homestead in the late afternoon, Birdie felt something she had not expected. Something warm and certain, moving through her chest like the first real warmth of a spring after a long winter. That, she said, was worth the 11 days of riding. Ezekiel looked at her sideways. His face in the late light was the kind of face that rewarded looking at. It only gets better, he said. 6 more families. 6 more chances to be worth something, she said. Birdie, he said, and his voice was gentle and serious simultaneously. You were already worth something. You were worth something before you ever rode out of Abilene. She looked ahead at the road. Her chest was doing something she had no useful language for. You are going to have to stop doing that, she said. Doing what? Saying things like that. A pause. Why? She glanced at him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention that she had been cataloging since their first morning with coffee in his office. That total, unhurried, genuine quality that made her feel like the most interesting thing in any room. Because, she said, it makes it very difficult to maintain a reasonable distance. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what if I did not want you to maintain a reasonable distance? Birdie's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Constance flicked her ear in mild acknowledgement. Then you would be making a very complicated situation significantly more complicated, she said. Complicated how? I am a widow, she said. I have nothing. No property as of yet. No settled address. No plan for the next year beyond a principal and a list of 7 names. I am riding across Texas to help strangers on behalf of a man I met 5 days ago who I once pointed a gun at. None of this is a reasonable foundation for anything. No, he agreed. It is not reasonable at all. Then we agree. We agree that it is not reasonable, he said. We do not agree that it is therefore impossible. She looked at him again. He was looking straight ahead now, riding easy in the saddle with that infuriating, unhurried certainty, and the corners of his mouth held the very beginning of a careful smile. She faced forward. She pressed her lips together to contain something that wanted to be a smile of its own. "Ezekiel Abbott," she said. "Birdie Barrett," he replied. Nothing more. Nothing was necessary. The road stretched ahead of them, and the sky above was enormous, and the October afternoon light was the color of honey. 2 weeks passed in the particular, intense intimacy that long shared travel creates. There is no performance in it. You cannot maintain a constructed version of yourself across hundreds of miles of open country in cold weather with limited resources and 2 horses that have opinions. You become, inevitably and thoroughly, exactly who you are. Birdie became who she was. Which was, she discovered in this company, a more interesting person than she had previously fully understood herself to be. She was funny, she found, in the dry particular way that comes from growing up in a family of straight talkers who valued precision. She was curious in a genuine and ranging way, interested in things far beyond the immediate practical, interested in what the land used to look like and what people had done with it and what it might become. She was stubborn, thoroughly and without apology, but she was also genuinely good at listening and at changing her mind when the evidence required it. Ezekiel seemed to find all of this, individually and collectively, deeply appealing. He did not perform his appreciation. He simply directed his attention at her consistently and completely, and she had enough honesty to recognize that this was one of the most intimate things anyone had ever done for her. They argued twice. Both arguments were real arguments, not performances, born of actual disagreement about actual things. The first was about the best route to the next family on the list, and it was brief and productive, and she turned out to be right, which he acknowledged without resentment. The second was larger and had more underneath it. They were camped 3 weeks into the journey, in a hollow out of the north wind, and the conversation had turned to Marcus Hale and the legal proceedings, and what would happen when the federal warrant came through. Birdie had said, quite directly, that she thought Hale should serve time in a federal prison, that the damage he had done was too broad and too deliberate to be resolved by fines or civil remedies. Ezekiel had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She had pressed him. "You disagree. I think," he said carefully, "that there is a part of me that wants something simpler and less legal." Birdie looked at him. "If you mean what I think you mean." "I do not intend to do anything foolish," he said, "but I will not pretend I have not thought about it." "Then you should stop thinking about it," she said, and her voice had an edge she did not smooth down. "Because you are not a man who does things like that, and because if you were, I would not be here." The words came out with more weight than she had intended, the full weight of what they meant, what she meant by them. The fact that his being a certain kind of man was, at this point, not just a practical consideration. He heard the weight. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the fire. "You are right," he said. "I know you are right." "I know you know," she said. "I am saying it anyway." He looked at her then, and the fire between them was small and bright, and his face was open in the way it occasionally was when he stopped managing himself entirely. "Birdie," he said. "Do not," she said. "I have not said anything yet." "I know what you are about to say." "Do you?" "Yes." A silence. She held it. She held it past the point of comfort into the territory where silences become their own form of confession. "I think," she said at last, carefully and precisely, as if she were composing a legal document, "that I have developed feelings for you that are considerably more serious than I intended and considerably more serious than is probably wise given the current state of my life, and the fact that we have known each other for 3 weeks and that my husband has been dead for 8 months. A long pause. "3 weeks," he said, "since you walked into my office and pointed a pistol at me." "Yes." "I would say," he said, equally carefully, "that under the circumstances, 3 weeks has been a fairly thorough acquaintance." She almost smiled. "You are being glib about something serious." "I am trying not to frighten you," he said. She looked at him fully. "Ezekiel, I have ridden alone across dangerous country to confront a man I thought might have killed my husband. I am not easily frightened." "I know," he said. "That is not what I meant." He took a breath. "I meant that I am aware that you have lost something large and are still in the middle of grieving it, and I do not want to be something that happens to you before you are ready for it to happen." That undid her. That precise, careful, deliberate tenderness. That understanding that love given at the wrong moment in the wrong way is still a kind of trespass. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a long kiss. It was not dramatic. It was the specific, honest, intended kiss of someone who has made a decision. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had no previous vocabulary for and did not need one. It was the expression of a man who has been given something he did not know he needed until the exact moment he received it. "I am not asking you to be anything," she said. "I am telling you that I am aware of what I feel and that I am not running from it. What happens from here we can figure out as we go." "I am very good at figuring things out as I go," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been watching you do it." They did not speak much more that evening. But when they slept, the camp felt different, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. The remaining weeks of the journey carried a different quality after that. Not reckless, not impulsive, but honestly and openly warm. He reached for her hand when they rode side by side, and she let him take it and sometimes kept his. They talked in the evenings about things that were not about Hale or the fraud or the families. Things that were purely about the texture of living, about what they wanted and feared and found beautiful and found funny, about the places they had been and the places they wanted to go. She told him about her mother's garden in Ohio, the roses her mother had carried from their original home in Pennsylvania in a tin can of dirt and replanted every place they moved. She told him about the first time she had seen the Kansas sky and how it had made her feel, simultaneously, very small and very free. He told her about a night in Virginia when he was 17, the year the war ended, watching the stars from the top of a hill and understanding for the first time that the world was larger than anything anyone had so far described to him. He told her about deciding at that moment that he would see as much of it as he could. "Have you," she asked, "seen as much as you wanted to?" He looked at her. The look was full of multiple things simultaneously. "I think," he said, "I'm still very much in the middle of that project." They reached the last family on the list, a young couple named the Washingtons, Frederick and Ida, who farmed a piece of land outside a small Texas town called Millhaven on the 5th week of their journey. Frederick Washington had borrowed $200 against his property and had been fighting the resulting debt for a year, a debt that had prevented him from expanding his crops and had put his family in a state of perpetual financial anxiety. He was a serious, intelligent man in his early 30s who listened to every word of the explanation with an absolute stillness, and then asked questions that were sharp and clear, and demonstrated a thorough understanding of both the fraud and the legal remedy. Ida Washington made them tea and fed them cornbread from the stove and talked to Birdie while the men discussed the documentation, and Birdie found in Ida a person of the same practical intelligence and determined warmth that she recognized as the specific quality of women who build real things in difficult places. "You came all this way to tell us," Ida said, watching Birdie with an expression of frank assessment. "It needed to be done," Birdie said. Ida looked at Ezekiel through the window where he was handing Frederick the relevant papers. "He came too," she said, "the man whose name was used." "Yes," Ida looked back at Birdie. "And he is also your man," she said. It was not entirely a question. Birdie considered this. It was the first time anyone outside her own head had named it directly. "That is a work in progress," she said. Ida smiled. It was a brilliant, comprehensive smile, the smile of someone who has been paying very close attention to the relevant evidence. "Some work is worth doing slowly," she said. "Some you should just get on with." Birdie laughed. It was her third laugh since February, but she had lost count of the exact number because somewhere in the last 5 weeks, the laughing had become something that happened with some regularity. which she found both remarkable and appropriate. They rode out of Millhaven on a gray afternoon with a promise of rain in the northwest sky, and the long road back to Redrock stretching ahead of them, and 7 families behind them who now knew the truth of their situation and held the documentation to prove it. It was a real thing, a solid thing, and Birdie held it in her chest the same way she had held the affidavit about her own property, close and warm and worth protecting. "That was the last one," Ezekiel said. "That was the last one," she agreed. They rode for a while in the companionable, deep-rooted quiet that had developed between them over 5 weeks and hundreds of miles. "What happens now?" he asked. She had been thinking about this since Millhaven, since Ida Washington's frank assessment, since the moment of honest acknowledgement over the small fire 3 weeks ago. "I need to go back to Kansas," she said. "I need to formally clear the lien and arrange the sale of the property. That is a month's work, possibly 6 weeks. And after that," she looked at him. "What are you asking, Ezekiel?" He met her look without deflection. "I am asking whether you have thought about what comes after Kansas, whether there is a place you are planning to land." "I have been thinking about it," she said. "I have been thinking about it too," he said. "I have been thinking about it since Redrock. Since the morning you sat in my office and drank my coffee and said your father was the most infuriating man you had ever loved." He paused. "I have not said it plainly yet, and I should. I am in love with you, Birdie. I have been falling in that direction for 5 weeks, and I am now firmly there." She had known. She had known it the way you know the color of the sky when you have been looking at it every day. But hearing it said plainly in his voice on a gray Texas road with the smell of coming rain and Constance walking steadily under her was a different thing than knowing it privately. It was the thing becoming real. "I am in love with you too," she said, "which is not something I was planning to say when I left Abilene." "No," he said with the beginning of that careful smile. "You were planning to collect what was owed." "I was," she said, "and then I left giving something I had not planned to part with." He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand, and she held it, and the first drops of rain began to come down cold and clean on the dry Texas road. They rode through the rain, and it was not unpleasant. The return to Redrock took 4 more days. They arrived on a Friday evening in late November, with the cold fully settled in and the town lit with lamps against the early dark. Ezekiel's office was intact, his hired man having managed it competently in his absence, and there were 2 letters waiting on the desk from Archibald Prout. The first letter confirmed that the federal circuit judge in San Antonio had received the fraud documentation and was proceeding with the case against Marcus Hale. A federal warrant had been issued the previous week. The second letter confirmed something else entirely. Marcus Hale had been apprehended. Not by the law, or not initially. He had been found by a rancher east of San Antonio whose land had also appeared on the list of fraudulent transactions, and the rancher had held him at gunpoint until the sheriff arrived. Hale was now in federal custody, and the case was proceeding. Birdie read both letters twice. Then she sat down in the chair across from Ezekiel's desk, the same chair she had sat in on that first afternoon with the gun still warm from her hand, and she let out a long, thorough breath that carried 8 months of weight. "It is over," she said. Ezekiel sat on the edge of his desk, reading over her shoulder. "The legal process will take months more," he said. "But the threat is over. He cannot hurt anyone else." "The families on the list," she said. "Prout has their documentation, copies to all of them," he confirmed. "And the federal case will reinforce each individual claim." She nodded. She thought about the Garcias and their children. She thought about the Washingtons and Ida's brilliant smile. She thought about all 7 families sleeping tonight without the particular weight of a fraudulent debt pressing on their lives. "We did something real," she said. "We did," he agreed. Then quietly, "You did. You are the one who got on a horse and rode here alone and refused to leave until justice was a real thing." She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with all of that specific, complete attention, and she was sitting in the same chair where she had first pointed a gun at him, and the distance between those 2 moments, The woman she had been when she walked through that door and the woman she was now felt both enormous and strange. "I gave you something I had not planned to part with," she said again. "Your heart, you mean," he said. "My certainty," she said. "I was certain when I left Abilene. I knew what I was going into, and what I was coming out of, and what the shape of my life was going to be. I was going to collect the debt, clear the lien, sell the property, go somewhere new, be independent, be sufficient unto myself. That was the plan. And now," she stood up. She was nearly the same height as his shoulder when he was sitting on the desk. She looked at him very directly. "Now the plan has changed," she said. "And for the first time in 8 months, the changed plan does not frighten me." He took her face in both hands, those large, calloused, careful hands, and kissed her properly this time. Not the brief, honest kiss by the campfire, but the full, thorough, certain kiss of two people who have decided. She kissed him back with the same certainty. When they separated, the lamp on the desk was still burning and the night outside was cold and the letters from Prout were still on the desk, and none of the practical questions of the future had yet been answered. "I still need to go to Kansas," she said. "I know. It will take 6 weeks at least. I know. And then I will come back," she said. The look on his face was one she would carry with her through those 6 weeks, through every cold night in the house in Abilene that smelled of another life, through every practical and necessary step of settling and closing and moving on. That look of a man who has been handed something he intends to keep. "I will be here," he said. She went to Kansas. She spent 6 weeks there, working with methodical focus through everything that needed to be done. The lien was formally cleared using the affidavit Prout had drafted. The property was listed for sale with a land agent. She sorted through the house with the particular, careful grief of closing a life, keeping what was hers and releasing what had been Thomas's, and she gave herself permission to feel the full weight of that grief without running from it, because it was real and it was right, and he had been a good man who deserved to be properly mourned. She wrote to Ezekiel. She had not expected to be a letter-writing person, had not expected that putting words on paper for a specific reader would feel any different than keeping a journal, but it was entirely different. It was the difference between talking to yourself and talking to someone who is listening. His letters back were long and thoughtful and sometimes funny and always direct, and she read each one 3 times. He told her about the progress of the federal case. He told her about a cold snap in Texas that had made the cattle miserable. He told her about a conversation he had with Archibald Prout in which Prout had said, with the benign obtuseness of a bachelor who has forgotten how the world works, that he supposed Birdie would eventually come back to collect some more of what was owed. Ezekiel had apparently said, dryly, that he supposed she would. She laughed at that one by herself in the cold house in Abilene and felt him close even with all the distance between them. The property sold in January of 1874 to a family named the Hendersons who had 3 children and a dog and had been looking for exactly this kind of modest, honest operation to build their future in. Birdie shook hands with Mr. Henderson and felt, to her genuine surprise, not grief but rightness. It was the right place for the right people. Thomas had built it with care and intention, and it was going to be used with care and intention, and that was what a thing built with love deserved. She packed everything she owned into 2 saddlebags and the old leather trunk that had been her mother's. She said goodbye to the land agent and to the family next door who had been neighbors for 3 years, and she got on Constance on a cold Tuesday morning in late January with the sky the flat white of midwinter Kansas and rode south. She rode back toward Texas. It was a different ride than the first one. The same country, the same roads, but everything seen from a different interior geography. She had ridden out of Kansas the first time pointed toward confrontation, propelled by fury and grief and righteous purpose. She rode back into Texas pointed toward something she did not yet have words for, but that felt, when she moved toward it, the way water feels when you have been walking in a dry country for a long time. She arrived in Redrock on a Thursday afternoon in late January, exactly 3.5 months after she had first ridden into town. The main street was familiar now, the buildings and the people, and the particular quality of the winter light on the Texas plains. She tied Constance at the post outside Ezekiel's office and went in. He was at his desk. He stood up the moment she came through the door. She had not told him the exact day she would arrive. She had said late January, and she had left it there, because she had not wanted either of them to be standing at a window waiting. He stood up from his desk, and she stood in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment. And the months and the distance were in the room, and so was everything else. All the miles and the letters and the campfires and the 7 families and the first kiss and the whole improbable, unplanned, impossible story of how they had arrived here. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would," she said. He came around the desk, and she walked into the room, and there was no performance in what happened, no drama, no grand gesture. He simply held out his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her in and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and breathed out. "The property sold?" he asked. "Yes, good people. Kansas, behind me." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "And ahead of you," she looked at him. She thought about Ida Washington and her frank assessment, and her advice about the work worth getting on with. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the fact that you have a cattle and land operation that needs someone with a strong aptitude for business and finance, and I have a demonstrated aptitude for business and finance, and nowhere in particular I need to be." He was very still. "Are you proposing a business arrangement?" "I am proposing a partnership," she said, "of more than one kind." He said nothing for a moment. His hands were on her arms, steady and warm. "Birdie Barrett," he said. "Ezekiel Abbott," she returned. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I had a whole speech prepared. I had been working on it for a month." "You can still give it if you want to," she said. "It seems somewhat redundant now," he said. "Then let me be direct," she said. "I came here in October with nothing but purpose and fury and a pistol. I rode back with something entirely different. I am in love with you. I want to build something with you. I want to be in this place and do this work and be in your life." He kissed her. It was the third kind of kiss, the one that comes after everything has already been decided and confirmed, and all the remaining question is simply one of how and when. When it ended, his forehead was against hers and his hands were in her hair. "I will need to order a ring," he said. "You have time," she said. "I just got here." "Not much time," he said. "I have been patient for 4 months." She laughed. The laugh was full and free and not counted. They were married in Redrock in March of 1874, in the small Methodist church on the east side of town, with Archibald Prout as witness and Consuelo Reyes in the front pew and Ezekiel's hired man, a taciturn Texan named Cal, who cried and appeared deeply embarrassed about it. The minister had a long beard and a kind face, and had been in Redrock for 15 years and had seen a great deal, and was not surprised by much. But he told Birdie afterward that he thought he had rarely seen 2 people come to the altar with more certain expressions on their faces. The ring Ezekiel had ordered from a jeweler in San Antonio was a simple gold band set with a small dark stone. Turquoise traded from a Comanche trader who came through Redrock twice a year. Blue-green and western, and entirely unlike the conventional choices. And she loved it precisely for what it was. She wore it on her right hand during the ceremony because her left was holding his, and she did not want to let go long enough to switch them. And later she moved it and looked at it on her hand in the March light and thought about the distance between October and March, between the widow and the wife, between what she had come to collect and what she had instead been given. She sent a letter to the Garcias and to the Washingtons and to the other families, telling them of the marriage, because they had been part of the story and deserved to know how it continued. Ida Washington wrote back within 2 weeks, and the letter contained enough warmth and dry humor to last a month. Marcus Hale's federal trial concluded in April of 1874. He was convicted on 7 counts of fraud and 3 counts of forgery, and sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison in Missouri. The properties affected by his fraudulent liens were formally cleared. The money he had taken was partially recovered from assets seized at the time of his arrest, and through a complex arrangement that Archibald Prout managed with considerable professional satisfaction, partial restitution was made to each of the defrauded families. It was not full justice. Birdie knew that. Thomas Barrett was still dead. That debt could not be repaid. But it was the real, specific, legal acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong, and that acknowledgement, she had come to understand, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the foundational thing. She threw herself into the business of Abbott land and cattle with the full force of the capabilities she had previously applied to running someone else's operation. She was, as she had told Ezekiel she would be, good at the numbers. She was, as she had suspected, also good at the negotiations and the market reading and the particular kind of forward planning that separates an operation that survives from one that grows. Within a year, the company had restructured its debt, settled its remaining legal entanglements, and was expanding its herd with a strategy she had designed and Ezekiel had refined, and both of them had argued about productively, until they reached the version that worked. They worked well together. They worked spectacularly well together in the particular way that happens when two people with complementary capabilities also have the kind of fundamental respect for each other that makes disagreement productive rather than destructive. They argued about the business with the same directness and genuine engagement that they had argued on the road to the first family, and they were right in approximately equal proportion, which each found privately gratifying and publicly useful. They had also, in the most straightforward sense, become each other's home. Birdie had not expected to feel it that quickly or that completely. She had expected to feel it slowly, the way land warms in the spring, incrementally and over time. But it was not slow. It was not gradual. It was the specific recognition, in every ordinary morning of making coffee and reading the accounts and arguing about the cattle prices, that this was the thing she had not known she was looking for when she left Kansas with a pistol and a principle. Not the safety she had imagined she wanted. Not the settled certainty she had planned for. Something more alive than that. Something that required her fully and rewarded her fully in return. Ezekiel had, she discovered in the months of living alongside him, a quality she had not expected from the composed, careful man who had sat across from her in that first confrontation. He was funny. Not performed funny, not social funny, but the deeply specific, dry, observational funny of someone who pays close attention to the world and has a strong internal sense of the absurd. He made her laugh more days than not, and the laughing had become one of the textures of her life, the way the Texas sky was one of the textures of her life, vast and present and reliably beautiful. He had also, she found, a deep capacity for tenderness that he expressed in the language of practical attention rather than in declarations. He noticed when she was tired before she said it. He brought coffee at the exact moment she wanted it without her asking. He remembered things she said in passing and acted on them weeks later with a casualness that was anything but casual, and she understood that being loved by Ezekiel Abbott was a quiet, thorough, continuous process that had no dramatic peak because it never stopped. She tried to love him in kind. She was less practiced at it than he was, but she was an honest person who believed in doing a thing properly, and she gave him her full attention and her full truth, and the full use of the intelligence and capability she possessed, which was considerable. And she discovered that loving someone with your actual whole self rather than the performed or managed or protected version of yourself was both more terrifying and more sustaining than anything she had previously understood love to be. In the autumn of 1874, a year after she had first ridden into Redrock, she told him she was expecting their first child. He was silent for a moment that she tracked very carefully because she was watching his face and she wanted to see the real thing before he composed himself. The real thing was completely unguarded happiness, enormous and sudden and young, and it lasted only a moment before the composed version came back up, but she had seen it and it had gone straight into the place in her chest where she kept the things she most needed. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been remarkably healthy about it so far. You should not ride as much," he said. "That is an entirely reasonable suggestion that I will take under consideration," she said, which was her precise way of saying she would think about it. He sat down. He sat down in the chair behind his desk, the chair where she had first encountered him, and he put his hands on the desk and looked at them for a moment. "We are building something," he said, not to her exactly, to himself, to the fact of it. "We are building something," she confirmed. Their son was born in June of 1875, on a hot Texas morning with Consuelo Reyes in attendance, and Archibald Prout inexplicably hovering outside the door of the house, as if there were legal paperwork required. He was dark-eyed like his father and had his mother's stubborn, precise expression from the first moment. He opened his eyes on the world, and Ezekiel held him in the afternoon light of the bedroom and looked at him with the same total, unguarded attention that he had always directed at Birdie, and she watched him discover this new object for his attention and felt something she did not have a word for in any language she had ever been taught. They named him Thomas Ezekiel Abbott, Thomas for the man who had started the story and whose death had set Birdie in motion toward everything she now had, and Ezekiel for the man who had become the central fact of her present and her future. It was an act of full honesty, which was the only kind of act Birdie had ever been comfortable making. Consuelo held him and called him the most handsome baby she had ever seen, which was a generous assessment but not entirely without basis. Cal held him with the rigid terror of a man who has never held a child and wants to get it right, and looked so relieved when Thomas did not immediately cry that everyone in the room laughed. Prout sent a letter of congratulations from his office 2 doors down, because Prout communicated important things by letter even when the recipient lived within walking distance, which was another thing Birdie found specifically charming about him. The Washingtons wrote. Ida's letter was warm and direct and contained, at the end, the specific dry observation that some work is indeed worth getting on with, and you appear to have gotten on with it very effectively. Birdie read it to Ezekiel and he laughed. They were, by 1876, an established operation in Redrock, respected and known, the kind of business that other people oriented themselves by. Ezekiel Abbott's name had been fully cleared in the records of the fraud case, the court documents explicitly stating that the fraudulent transactions had been conducted without his knowledge or consent, and the name Abbott Land and Cattle Co. stood for what it had always been intended to stand for, a real operation run by real people who meant what they said. Birdie managed the accounts with the precise attention of a woman who understood very personally what happened when numbers went wrong, and she was the particular kind of businessperson who made other business people feel they were being dealt with fairly, which made her extraordinarily effective. She was known in town as a woman of substance and intelligence, and no one who had transacted business with her made the mistake of underestimating her twice. She was also, in the life of the business and the life of the marriage, deeply happy. She had not expected the happiness to be as complete as it was. She had expected something good and real and earned, as she had always expected the things she worked for to be real. She had not expected to wake up most mornings with a physical sense of rightness, a settled, specific, not going anywhere happiness that was both quiet and profound. Thomas grew into a boy of enormous energy and strong opinions, which everyone agreed he had received in equal and generous measure from both of his parents, and he was deeply attached to Constance, Birdie's gray mare, in the way that children of the West are attached to horses. He had Ezekiel's stillness and Birdie's precision, and his own particular energy that was entirely his own, and they were both besotted by him in the thorough, slightly surprised way of people who had not fully anticipated what it would be to love a small person who contained so much of themselves. In the winter of 1876, Birdie told Ezekiel she was expecting again. This time he did not sit down. This time he took her face in both hands and kissed her on the forehead and the cheek and the mouth in that order with a thoroughness that made her laugh. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "A bigger house," he said. "We have been meaning to build one," she said. "We are building one in the spring," he said. "That is the first time you have said a thing without framing it as a suggestion requiring my consideration," she observed. He looked at her. The careful smile, worn deeper into its permanent groove after 2.5 years of use, lit up his face. "Was that all right?" She considered it with mock seriousness. "In this particular instance," she said, "I think it was appropriate." The second child arrived in August of 1877, a girl with Birdie's dark blonde hair and Ezekiel's dark eyes, a combination so specifically arresting that Consuelo held her and said she had never seen such a child, which was the same thing she had said about Thomas, but which Birdie chose to believe was true in both cases. They named her Clara Ruth Abbott, Clara for Birdie's mother and Ruth because Ezekiel had loved the biblical Ruth since childhood, the story of a woman who chose where she belonged with her whole heart and stayed. Birdie had held Clara in the new house, the larger house that had indeed been built in the spring of 1877, in the room they had made for the children with the window that faced east, and she had thought about Ruth, about choosing where you belonged, about the particular act of will that turns a place you ended up into a place you chose. She had not chosen Redrock. She had landed in it by fury and intention and the trail of a fraud. She had not chosen Ezekiel Abbott. She had pointed a gun at him, and he had shown her a ledger, and somewhere in the space between the gun and the ledger, between the widow's fury and the honest man's evidence, something had begun that had become the whole shape of her life. She had not planned to give anything away when she rode into this town. She had planned to take something back, and she had taken something back, the documents, the cleared lien, the name of the man responsible, the legal machinery of justice set in motion. She had collected every bit of what was owed, and she had left giving something she had not planned to part with, her certainty, her plan, her carefully constructed future of solitary independence and movable freedom. She had left giving all of that, and she had received in return something that was not what she had planned but was, in every way that mattered, more. She looked at Clara Ruth, sleeping in her arms in the east-facing room, and at Ezekiel in the doorway with Thomas on his hip and his eyes on her face with that particular, permanent, 24 hours a day quality of attention that had never once wavered in 3 years of marriage. "All right?" he asked. She looked at her family in her home, in her chosen place, in the life she had built from the wreckage of the life she had lost. "All right," she said. "More than all right." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and Thomas climbed between them with the practiced confidence of a child who has never doubted his welcome, and they sat in the August morning with the new baby and the small family, and the life that had made itself out of fury and fraud and 11 days of hard riding, and a gun pointed at a man's chest, and a cup of coffee, and a long road with 7 families on a list. There was a letter on the side table that had arrived the previous week from Ida Washington. She and Frederick had come through a difficult year but were stable. The fraudulent lien had been fully cleared. They had planted a larger crop this spring. Their youngest had learned to walk, life continuing, families holding, justice, slow and imperfect but real, having done its work. Outside the window, the August sky of Redrock, Texas, was the particular profound blue that exists only in that latitude in that season, a blue so wide and honest it asked nothing of you except that you look at it. Birdie looked at it. Thomas reached up and patted her cheek with a small, authoritative hand, which was his standard method of reclaiming attention. Ezekiel caught his son's hand and kissed it and looked at Birdie over Thomas's dark head and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The widow had come to collect what was owed. She had collected it. Every last cent, every piece of justice, every name and document and legal remedy that the situation required. She had ridden in alone and furious and righteous, and she had not left empty-handed. She had also not left. And what she had given that she had not planned to part with had returned to her, multiplied and shaped into a life, into a home, into the faces of the two small people who carried her eyes and his, and the whole improbable, necessary story of how they had come to be. She held her daughter and let the August light come in through the window, and the day moved forward with the unhurried certainty of a life that has found its true direction, and she was content, not in the small, careful way of a person who has settled for what they could get, in the full, complete, earned way of a person who has understood what they needed, gone after it without flinching, and found at the end of the road that the world had given them something better than what they had gone looking for. She closed her eyes in the morning light. Ezekiel's hand found hers. Outside, the Texas sky was enormous and honest and blue. She was home.